Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Friday Windup. And this is Unit 2 that we're going to finish this week. Hopefully by now you'll see that we're sort of getting into a sort of a nice sort of routine with the units, that they run, as we said, over these 5-day periods. So the idea there is that we want to try and give you a sense of working your way through the unit during the week, over the 5 days, and then perhaps having a weekend break as well. So we're up to Unit 2, and you'll notice, certainly from the activities that we've been doing and the work that we set out at the beginning of the week, that we're still looking very much at how we use technology to help us interact with other people. Remember that we made the point last week, very important point, that the web is not just simply a connection of wires and devices. What it really is a connection of minds. Your mind, in fact, with everyone else's that's on the web as well. And of course, what's so powerful about that is the ability to share and discuss ideas. We communicate really through ideas. And we've been looking in the last couple of weeks at some of the problems that throws up, some of the challenges, but also some of the great things that happen when people get together and share ideas in a positive way. So, before we get started, one quick sort of administrative point I want to make. We've got a Twitter hash for this MOOC. You'll see it on some slides in a moment, but I would very much encourage you to, if you don't use Twitter, get into Twitter and start following us. We have a hashtag. It's called DigitalMe MOOC. I mean, surprise, surprise, but there you are. You'll see it on the pages in a moment. I've added it onto my screenshots that I want to use this week, but of course it's in the course as well. I'm going to be using that hashtag more and more as the MOOC goes on, as a way of communicating and talking, making announcements directly to the people on this course, so that we sort of build up a following, if you like. As with all of these things, not only am I using it for its own sake, but I want to use it in order to help demonstrate the value of social media here as a method of supporting the social cohesion that's required when you're running what one might call a virtual class. In Unit 3, you're going to hear Paula talk about how the class actually is sort of no longer a place, it's more an activity, because it continues. It's a continuous process across the week, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so on. Doesn't matter where you are on the planet. The idea of the classroom being the critical learning space really is not as strong as it used to be for that reason. So things like social media, and certainly things like Twitter, are really important tools that we can use to help keep us held together, in a sense, keep the social cohesion of the learning going on as well. One other very important thing about things like social media, I'm going to come on to this in more detail in a moment, is the degree to which business and the way that the rest of the world works uses devices like Twitter, uses social media as a means to help its own organization, but also indeed in terms of marketing, communicating with its customers and those that sort of keep them in business, is a really, really important tool. Just I say, all of the social media tools really we've got to sort of get to grips with. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So what were we doing in this unit? Well, it was fairly similar to Unit 1, but you'll notice that actually that we've upped the ante a bit. In the first unit, we simply asked you to crowdsource ideas, and many of you actually took great delight in the way those ideas flowed and the way it challenged some of our assumptions and so forth. In Unit 2, though, we went a little bit further. We asked you not just to sort of tell us what you're up to, but to start to justify what you're up to with the media and with the applications that you use in education, and also to look at what other people are saying and respond to that as well. What we were trying to do was to get you to do one of what, in fact, are 5 things that we do when we confront new information, basically, which are, or rather, 5 acceptable things. There are some unacceptable things being done. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the 5 acceptable things. The first thing is that when we encounter something that we find interesting, try and refine it. In other words, we can take what we've seen and say, well, actually, you could actually be more precise, or we can actually get deeper into the subject. We can, in other words, you have something that you've got to offer that will improve the idea that you've seen, which is for the benefit of the original writer and also for the wider community following your discussion as well. The other thing that we can do, and we have to be careful with this one a little bit, is that we can correct factual inaccuracy. Remember that it's very difficult to correct opinion, because an opinion is, by definition, a view that someone has come to, hopefully through rational reasoning based on evidence. But sometimes people can be factually wrong, and that is, a fact is a fact. It is either right or it is wrong. So if someone's got something wrong, then it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, I think you'll find that that's wrong because this is right. But we have to do it in a very careful way. Remember that what we talked about in the first unit about the ability to make sure we don't offend people because of the cultural nuances that we might miss, or that we tend to say things in a language that can be seen as confrontational. But it is perfectly correct that we correct factual inaccuracy, because anything that a decision that anyone comes to, any summary that anyone comes to that's based on factual inaccuracy, will almost certainly mean that the summary and the conclusion is itself inaccurate as well, for some reason. The third thing you may have done is that you may have added further detail to what has been said. So you've taken an idea and you've embellished it, you've added more detail to it. I said, well, you've talked about someone in Unit 1 actually lived on a desert island, and it was a great example of the ability to say, well, I see what you're saying about desert, but I live on one, and let me tell you about that. So it's that ability, if you like, to add more information in. Fourthly, we can find and suggest alternative ways of looking at something. So we respond to an idea online by saying, well, have you looked at it from a different direction? Very often we find really good answers to problems, or sometimes we find better questions to problems, because somebody has simply taken the trouble to approach the problem from a different direction. If you see a problem from a different angle, then it will almost certainly offer you alternative suggestions and different ways of tackling that particular problem. And then finally, how we can help people adapt, criticize, find alternative solutions from elsewhere. So we can say to people, I like what you've done, interesting source, here's another source that you might like to look at that gives an alternative view. The idea there is that we give people the ability to do what we're going to go on to look at in Unit 3, which is to synthesize knowledge from a variety of sources rather than simply one, albeit one that's been improved, revised, refined, positively criticized, and all the rest. It's just the ability to give people that ability to look elsewhere. And this really is the notion of where we're going in this Unit 3, and how the idea of a classroom has changed. Away from the idea that we sit passively in a classroom and that a teacher tells us, in effect, what is the truth, in inverted commas, whatever that may be, but nevertheless what they believe to be the truth, and that students simply consume that information as if it was a chocolate bar or something like that. Because what's happened now is that with the advent of the web, the ability to find information from a myriad of sources, some of them very good, some of them very poor, is quite fantastic. And we have to apply the two great tests that are so important, and you're probably doing this already, but you're not realizing it, and it's useful to study the two terms. We're talking about reliability and we're talking about validity, the two things that we apply. When anyone tells us anything, we run it through the rinse cycle, if you like, or we put it through our own personal filters in our brain, where we say to ourselves, how valid is this that I've just been told? How reliable is this? Just a quick look at those two things. When we talk about reliability, we ask ourselves, what I've just heard, is it credible? Is it something that might well be repeated if I had a go at it? And most of science actually rests on advancement through reliability tests. If I were to repeat that experiment, I would get the same result. So we want to be able to apply that not just to science, but also to the social sciences and the humanities as well. So we look for credibility, we look to see for reliability of the information we're given. And then we talk about the validity of information as well, which is where we look at the source of that information and say, has this person got a record for telling things as they really are? Is it someone that I've relied on in the past? Do they have a particular view? And you'll notice in Unit 3 we mention the example of the fox hunting debate, which is a very, very big subject in this country. Now, you would be very surprised, as indeed I would, if the League Against Cruel Sports came out with a press statement saying that on balance they thought fox hunting was a brilliant idea. They're not going to do that. They're obviously going to say, because that is the nature of it, that they don't think it's a good idea. But that means that there is a responsibility placed on us as readers or consumers of that information to say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So let's see what of this message is credible, and let's see what is perhaps propaganda, maybe. I mean, certainly people will try that. Advertising is Is it not simply the temporary suspension of belief and credibility in order to foster a desire to buy something? I mean, you know, we're bombarded with information all the time and invited to buy a line and buy into something. So we have to, as people that use the web, particularly when we don't necessarily have body language to use either as well, we have to be able to take information on board, decide through our own filters what we're going to use and what we're going to discard, and then synthesize new information on the basis of that. And that's what we're going to ask you to do in the boards that you write on this time. So when you make your entries in Unit 3, think about how you're going to justify the point that you're making to your audience. Is it that you have inside knowledge? Is it something that you've previously studied? Is it something that you've come to from a reasoned point of view, and here is my reason, and so forth? I want you to have a look at that sort of thing. So let's get back to Unit 2 and just finish on the wind-up, really, so that we can see how this leads very neatly into that third unit that we're going to do. As I said, with those 5 headings, you may not have realized this is what you're doing, but if you look at some of the threads, and indeed I've gone through some, I've responded to as many as, there are hundreds in there, and I simply can't respond to them all, they're just too many, but there's some fantastic points of view put across there. And many students have in a sense done the work for me in that they have responded as I would like them to have done, and others have responded, and so we've got little chains running, if you like, or threads of discussion going through, where students have come back in and said, well, actually, yeah, here's an alternative suggestion. Try this instead. It does the same thing, but it's a different application, and you know, you might like to have a look at that. Incidentally, we noticed in the wind-up that's actually a thread for today that we're already getting people talking about this really difficult problem. The fragmentation of applications, the fragmentation of software now means that it's not just a sort of proliferation of information that's available on the net, but it's the sheer proliferation of applications as well that we can use. And it's very difficult to know which ones are right and which ones we should leave out and so forth. I have heard it argued that one of the important roles of any e-learning champion is deciding what not to go with, so that the teachers and others in organisations aren't bombarded with loads of applications, but someone has put together, if you like, a little package of applications that work well together and are worth investing time and effort in. But I do sympathise with that issue. One of the great values of this list is that we can see what kinds of applications have emerged as people say, look, this is really good in teaching, and there's a kind of a consensus, if you like, going on. In fact, let me just correct that. It isn't people giving us applications good in teaching. They're saying that it's good applications in learning. And I think that's actually perhaps a more important point that we need to grasp here. YouTube, indeed, has had a huge following on the lists in Unit 2. And that's great, because that's where people have been responding and refining and adding further detail and talking about alternative ways of using it. It's exactly the skill that we wanted to do, this idea of enhancing the ideas and suggestions. So for those of you that feel overwhelmed with the sheer volume of applications, take heart from the fact that there is actually a consensus emerging about what are the good apps that are worth using, and in fact you've got a good guide in that Unit 2 wind-up already. One of the important things I think that came out of that discussion was the applications that were discussed were very much around what one might call social media. And social media is very sort of much the new player on the block. I'm going to just sort of show you some slides now. We're going to make these available to you on the MOOC site, so that you can get access to them a little bit later on if you want to have a look at them. But have a look at this. I mean, when we talk about the nature of social media, it's very much about communications technology. It's not gaming, it's not necessarily learning as such, although of course learning and gaining and pleasure comes from it, but it's all about communication. It's the sharing of ideas, and it deals in words, and more so now in pictures and video. You'll discover later on in the MOOC how the hashtag, apart from just being used on Twitter, is now being used by young people spontaneously, and by young I mean primary school age children, pre-10-year-olds, that when they write sentences they tend to put a hashtag emotive phrase at the end of a sentence in order to provide the emotional context. So, for example, I might well put the sentence, "Today is my birthday," and then after it I would put hashtag "I am happy." So the emotional content of the sentence is now wrapped up behind a hashtag at the end of the word. That has happened spontaneously. Quite extraordinary, really, how youngsters are changing the language, and here actually changing the grammar in order to accommodate something that they've acquired from the use of the hashtag in Twitter. Social media is owned by the individual, but it relies very much on sharing. There is nothing social about social media when one writes something with the intention of not showing it to anybody else. That is not really social media. It freeforms in the cloud because we want it to be widely available, so we tend not to keep it fenced in at all in the site. Most social media is cloud-based. It is both transient yet permanent. So, you know, what one posts on Twitter may stay there for all time, but it is meant to have a shelf life, perhaps of no more than an hour or two, if that. It is normally very quick stuff. Subject matter is always me, but it coalesces around topics. And this is one of the interesting things about social media, is that because the subject matter is always me, and in your case, you, it is a tool that indirectly describes and defines us to the rest of the world, often done unconsciously, subconsciously rather, as well. We don't necessarily know we're doing it, but social media is a very powerful tool in helping establish our digital identity online and saying who we are, you know, what we believe in, what our values are, what things we take pleasure from, who we like to be associated with, and so forth. This cool factor thing at the end is really important. I mean, just from what I was saying about the 10-year-olds there and the use of the hashtag, I think is really important. This idea of having cool factor in there as well. You'll have noticed how Facebook used to be the app of the day, but of course once youngsters realised that adults were using it as well, they moved on to the next thing, which was Twitter. And now that we're in there as well, they've moved on to the next thing, which is this thing called Snapchat and so on. So this cool factor is there because it personifies itself in the fact that young people tend to lead with new social media, and then they move on to the next thing as older people, particularly their parents, move in there as well. It's quite an interesting phenomena that's come about. Okay, so let's get back into the course here. Social media in learning is quite a new thing, but perhaps in the last 5 years or so. And it's all part of this translation, I think, of technology that's occurred in that time away from technology that was purely shared into technology that is much more personal. Now, we've referred to this previously in the MOOC, and we're going to refer to it again a little bit later on, because the big challenge there is in the world, I think, for us as individuals, and certainly in the world of education as well, if you're moving into this, is this need for us all to catch up with the consequences of technology that is now no longer in a single shared space, but is actually atomized almost into personal applications that are then fitted and customized together around us, so that they actually enhance us as individuals out there on the web, rather than asking us to behave in a compliant fashion as dictated by a single piece of shared technology. And that is a huge change that's gone on. I'm just, again, be able to share with you an idea here that this is how it's actually looked. You can see here, if you go to any school, any college, any university, basically there are 4 pillars on which all e-learning activity and content and platforms lie. And you can say to that college, university, what virtual learning environment are you using? That's where collaborative learning takes place. And we can have a look at what kind of tools are used to capture the administration of learning, often centered around the individual learning plan, and things like target setting, individual assessment, initial assessment, disciplinary punctuality issues, all that kind of thing. And then you can see these sort of new kids on the block that came in away from shared to personal space, the use of portfolios, the ability of students in order to capture, and not just students, but indeed all of us, to capture our own unique selves through our learning journeys, through our interests, and all the things that we were just talking about that we use social media for, which you can see at the bottom. Now, I've drawn this arrow to say that over the last 10 years or so, we have continued on this journey away from, well, not away from, but we're certainly moving away from, to a degree, the shared spaces and accommodating and taking on board the personal spaces. Certainly in the world of education, we still have a way to go in order to get there. The world of commerce and business, I think, has actually moved at a much faster rate in order to get there, because they have to, you know, in order to survive. I mean, it's a survival issue for them as well. But I suspect that in the future that we will find the notion of a shared virtual learning environment will shrink back a bit. And because we will have robust individual learning plans, and that's where I think a lot of the administration learning will go, we're going to see much higher rates of us as individuals using our own portfolios in order to capture our own discerning, unique learning story, and also the use of social media to hold the whole thing together. And that the VLE of the future will be some kind of combination, if you like, of a portfolio and social media. Incidentally, on the bottom of that slide, as on the other ones, you can now see that hashtag that I was referring to, hashtag DigitalMe MOOC. If you're not following it already, please get on and start following it, because I'm going to be using it, and it would be lovely to see students using it as well on this MOOC, so that we can actually get a conversation running. I would be interested, as perhaps you will be, to see, as part of this MOOC, where that Twitter account takes us in terms of what we discuss on it, and how it supports the learning generally, and how it supports this MOOC specifically. That will be, I think, very interesting indeed. Now, one of the things that you've been working on, I hope, and certainly looking at what I've seen in the unit so far, really good evidence of, is the reflective forms. I can't emphasize enough how important that activity of reflecting on what you've done is, really, in terms of capturing your own learning. The learning outcomes for this MOOC are listed there. And this is this great approach, if you like, quite a new approach, to say, look, instead of you being passive and assessed by somebody else, we're asking you to validate what you write and what you've done and your own activity against one or more of those learning outcomes, which you're then able to share with others, of course, and use after the course. Filling out those reflective forms is not something that's compulsory in order to gain the badges that you're after on this, but I do think it actually sort of rounds off the learning that you do. And it's nice to go back into those reflective forms as well, particularly once you've had an opportunity to consider what's talked about in the wind-up here as well, so that you can just give a more sort of rounded performance. Let me show you why I think reflection is so important in this MOOC. Let's just put another screen share up here. Now have a look at this at the bottom. It's, again, I know it's quite small. There is a little button that you can click on your screens that you can enlarge this slide. But if you want, you can just wait, and as I say, these will be available on the wind-up page of the MOOC, so that you can download and look at them in PDF form at your leisure. But you can see here that I'm describing, if you like, 5 things that we do when we learn something. 5 things we do when we genuinely learn something. Obviously, we acquire factual knowledge, which we add to our library of knowledge, but then we turn that common knowledge into something that we understand, or that we make sense of, if you like, that knowledge by applying it to our own circumstances and interests and so forth. And then, because we now have old knowledge and new knowledge that we've tried to fit together with new understanding, it requires a degree of synthesis to go on as well. We have to adjust the way we see the world generally as a result of our new understanding. With that new understanding, of course, and with that synthesized knowledge, we can then be imaginative about it and say, well, now that I know this, then what if, or why not, or why doesn't, or how should, are the kind of questions that we then go on and ask ourselves. In other words, we try to apply our new knowledge in more interesting ways, and perhaps that might take us off into new journeys, but it also might actually help us understand what we've gained, really, from that period of knowledge. And then ultimately, on the result of all of that, we can then step back from the whole process, look at what's gone on, and reflect on it. And my take here is, of course, is that unless we do all those 5 things, we don't actually get insightful development at all. And you can see that I've taken an item away in each case and suggested how that might affect our learning. Of course, everything is important in this particular table here, of course, because if we don't want to be prejudicial through lack of knowledge. We don't want to make errors because we've misunderstood. We don't want to have tunnel vision because we've not been able to think more widely than simply the problem and issue and the knowledge that was presented to us. And certainly without imagination, we don't want our ideas to stagnate and for us to become intellectually dull. But reflection is where we do the checking, because reflection actually is the process of saying, what have I learned? How have I understood that? How might have I applied that? And what else might I do with that information? That's what we do when we reflect. And it's a personal experience that we do as if we stand to one side and look across to us, so like an out-of-body experience, in order to reflect on something that has happened, those steps that have happened in the past. Really want you to think about this very carefully, and when you're writing and thinking on the boards, that you do so in a reflective manner, because that's where I think your learning will come. So in the reflective forms, I think that's really where the value comes to you. You're very welcome to use reflective practice as well on the storyboards as well, but the storyboards is really where you're going to exercise your knowledge and understanding, your synthesizing and your imagination. But your reflection, ideally, I think, belongs privately in that Moodle form, which you then tie up with your learning outcomes. So you can see how the whole thing hopefully sort of fits together. This piece at the top, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to start to sort of draw the whole thing to a close now. But you can see at the top here, I've talked about social media having these sort of two really important dimensions for us. Inside the class, talking to each other, talking to our classmates, we're dealing in this idea of doubted learning. We're trying to improve each other's ideas by what we bring to the table, which means, and I think this is perfectly acceptable to say, that as students, we may not know everything, and we are therefore sharing learning which we are perfectly entitled to doubt until we have tested it for ourselves, and until we have applied those rules, if you like, of validity and reliability. So as students, we deal now much more, when we're talking to each other rather than just sitting and listening to a teacher, much more in doubted learning, and sifting through it and finding out what's right, what we want to reject, what we can improve, how we can refine information, and of course all the time we're doing this, we're helping our classmates refine what they see as well. It's this great ability to collaborate in learning through the use of social media, and indeed through the use of VLEs more formally perhaps as well. But of course, doubted learning and this reliability, validity test, checking things, testing, synthesizing, reflecting, these are all indicative of critical thinking skills. And the world runs and revolves and survives on the ability of humans to think critically. So what you're doing here is rehearsing skills that you will use day in, day out in your private and your commercial lives. And that's why, again, it's really important. You won't stop and say to yourself, what have I done here in terms of knowledge, understanding, synthesis? But this is what you do. It's a kind of a subconscious rinsing process that you put everything through in order to see what you make of it, and what you're going to buy and what you're going to discard, what you think is worth using and what you think is rubbish. And then on the basis of what's worth using, create your new understanding that you can share with your classmates. The outside aspect of social media we're not going to touch on today, because we're going to talk far more about that in Units 4 and 5, because after Unit 3 we start to move away from looking at digital literacy in terms of pure learning and start to look at it, how it affects our private lives, and how it reflects and affects us as individuals as well, in terms of being safe, being able to use it so that technology doesn't control us, but hopefully we are in control of it, and so on. So we're going to be looking at that digital reputation, a very big theme of our last unit. So we'll come on to that at the end. So folks, that's it. Well done to everyone for the work that you've done in Unit 2. Really good, and very, very pleased. I will continue to try and read some of the material that's there and work my way through, but I can't possibly answer them all. But happy also to sort of follow any comments and stuff that people want to tweet about as well as we go along. I do hope you enjoy Unit 3. I hope you find lots of stuff that you can use, that's reliable, that's valid, that's coming from each of you. And remember that when you're sharing anything on the boards from now on, try to think about how well you have addressed those issues yourself in order to help those that are about to consume it on the other side. That's it. Have a good weekend. Let's get on with Unit 3. Bye for now.